Hello and welcome. So good to have you join us today. I am Brett Theodos. I'm a senior fellow at the Urban Institute where I lead our community economic development hub. And we are thrilled to be joined today with some really top folks who are thinking about how to shape and guide the municipal bond market. This is a huge market, as we're going to hear about, with lots of implications for communities, and yet it can be one, two, or even three steps removed from what many people experience in terms of how they know and understand investment into their city or county or neighborhood. So I'm going to walk us through a couple of housekeeping things. We're going to have a table setting discussion. We're going to introduce a new tool to help issuers of municipal bonds better consider social and racial equity dimensions in the investments that they're making. And then we're going to have a discussion about how the field is shaping and moving and growing and what we can do going forward. So, a couple of housekeeping things. First, this event is being recorded and we will put it online so you can share it with a friend. We are going to hide captions or adjust settings, but you can change that in the live transcript button that you see in your Zoom. Speaker bios are online, so are slides, so are some resource links. So we're not going to spend a lot of time going through who's who here, but feel free to check out more. Participants are muted for the duration of the event, but we do want to hear from you. So please type your questions and comments into the Q&A box that you will see. And during the moderated panel portion of our event, we will draw some of those themes into the discussion. And last, we want to continue to do a better job with our events. So please go ahead and fill out a survey that we will share at the end and right now as well. Okay, so I am first gonna turn to collaborator, colleague, friend, Lourdes Herman, who is going to set the stage, talk about the exciting initiative that she leads over at Public Finance Initiative. So Lourdes, we'll pass it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Brett and Urban Team. It is such a privilege to be here and specifically to be your partner and collaborator in this work, which has taken us over a year and to begin to share it with the world. My name is Lourdes Drummond, and as Brett said, I'm the Executive Director of the Public Finance Initiative, a nonprofit focused on centering the values of equity, sustainability, and inclusive growth in public finance decision making. And a little bit of how I'm going to start this presentation is to level set what does it mean to even think about municipal bonds, and what does it mean to center a value in that work, and how does that lead us to the creation of this tool? So if you see the pictures on this slide, they represent all of the things, and there's so much more that I could have included around which municipal bonds touch: schools, roads, bridges, your town hall, your city hall, a fire truck, other centers of public safety, parks, forests. And it's not just here in the US, it really is throughout the world. But here in the US, we have the benefit and privilege of having one of the most mature capital markets. So there's about $4.1 trillion of municipal bond debt outstanding. That's probably touching all of the projects in your neighborhood in one way or another at some part of their useful life. And one of the questions that we had the privilege of asking ourselves is, what does it mean to center a value in that work? Specifically, if we really consider the power of that money, of that person, to drive catalytic change in one of the most difficult and entrenched areas that we know is hard to move the needle on, and that's an understatement. And in order to figure that out, I'm going to show you a series of photos that represent stories from different communities who are answering that question even well before we started to do this work, and certainly throughout and after. And if you're asking yourself, what is this? This is a photo of a demolition project in Detroit. And it was funded with a bond issuance called the Social Bonds for Proposal N. And this project is one that really is emblematic of what it means to many people in the municipal bond market to say a deal, a transaction, where we are lending money, from investors to a community to do a project like this and to carry it out, centers of value. And here you see a little bit of a screenshot from an article that describes, what Detroit did. And they added the label social to the offering in order to bring forward and highlight to investors who were socially conscious, who cared about sustainability, who cared about impact, that this deal is not just a deal that's cookie cutter, but it actually really, really focuses on driving forward some type of change or speaking to that sustainability value that an investor might care about. And Detroit is not alone. Chicago, for example, is another community of many that's doing this. Chicago social bonds were united with a larger plan of finance that included funding for many projects that, as you see on this slide, were intended to fight climate change, focus on affordable housing, strengthening neighborhoods. And we're part of a larger strategy that also included American Rescue Plan Act funds that also centered an equity directive. And I'm going to show you a harder photo. What could this represent? And if you pause and think about it, this could be a water or sewer tunnel anywhere across America. And the reason why I included in this presentation is because this is one of the most powerful learnings we had when we began this work. There are so many water and sewer authorities across the country that specifically in providing funding to communities, cities and towns to carry out water projects, also do so with awareness of disadvantaged communities and their needs. And as we know, with the advent of the infrastructure bill, there are many subsidies and programs that specifically enable the flowing down of capital to many of those communities to fund vital infrastructure that's invisible to well-being and health, including water and sewer systems. And this is sort of one of the most powerful aha moments for me and many others at the table when we said, are we seeing a paradigm shift where racial equity, social equity values are being united in so many different ways, not just at the deal level, but at a programmatic and loan level? And this picture is probably the hardest of all of them. If you're looking at this and saying, why did she include this? This is a photo of a woman who is staffing a workforce development program desk in Las Cruces, New Mexico, a city that taught us that the way that they're centering racial equity as a value when they think about municipal bond markets and the power of that market for change is specifically by using the investment earnings. The money that is earned when these large sums, raised from a municipal bond issuance sit in a bank account, and they're specifically putting it towards workforce development outcomes and programs that specifically unite and elevate a racial equity value. And we were really privileged because we felt like, and I'll quote my colleague David Wood, who's one of the partners and collaborators in this work, as you see on this slide, when he said, I think we're on the forefront of a paradigm shift. We're seeing a market that is evolving, and specifically there's all this activity that we didn't know even existed that showed us a really wide continuum of action where on their own, in a self-directed way, communities across America were basically saying, this is what it means to me to do this work. And we felt that those stories were a little bit invisible. So with the partners that you see on the right hand of this slide, and also an advisory committee that we consider to be our leadership brain trust, and also the generous funding of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, we launched the Bond Markets and Racial Equity Project about 2 years ago, and specifically spent our first year in deep learning and with partners that you see on this slide, and then shared what we learned with the field. So with the National League of Cities, we had focus groups with over 100 leaders across the country who basically told us what they were doing, how they were perceiving the market, and what they needed in order to refine and strengthen racial equity outcomes and intents using this transaction and a security. We also spoke to investors because their role is vital. If they don't come to the table, you have nothing in this market, particularly that can move the needle with the resources that are needed to fund projects. And the Harvard Initiative for Responsible Investing organized on their own a group of the largest asset owners and institutional investors in the country who really said, we care about racial equity as a topic for responsible investor action. And we learned from them specifically what they wanted to see in the way the market should evolve. And then we know that there are many other stakeholders at the table, including rating agencies and others, and the Milken Institute became our partner. All of these reports are available on our website, by the way, sharing the learnings from these 3 vital channels that educated us in the creation of what you see here, which is a framework that our organization, in partnership with the many collaborators that you saw in communities who joined us throughout focus groups throughout the country, and then we came back to them for feedback, helped us create this as a roadmap to answer the question that you see on the center of this slide. How do you do this? And we found 5 meaningful entry points that were occurring outside of our work, in which we really thought would serve as the pillars of how to organize a body of work that could help an issuer who wanted to lean in and either perfect what they were doing or begin from scratch, consider an entry point. And those included starting at the jurisdiction and considering what is happening either at a loan program level or within the issuer as a government. considering whether or not they're racial equity informed community engagement strategies that are thoughtful and actually bringing communities to the table, and particularly underrepresented groups in meaningful ways. The plan of finance for the bonds is a vital and often under-examined element that could really be vital to racial equity outcomes or other social outcomes. And then specifically where the market already places a lot of attention, the use and management of proceeds, the way we think about that project that's actually going to deliver results in place for a community, population, or just with place-based outcomes that we want to achieve. And then finally, the rigor that we needed to see in measurement and reporting of racial equity risk or impact over time, speaking to both sides of what we discovered through our investor conversations, were two very different ways to look at the world and to think about measurement. And finally, what we did was we also, if you wonder, like, what does it mean to actually do this? And this will kind of lead up to what's, why we collaborated with Urban on this tool that we're so excited to launch today. We thought that roadmap has to include tangible things that people can do, including a moment to pause. And in this rubric developed by two of our partners in the program, ask, what are your goals? Is everybody fluent in the jurisdiction around what you're trying to achieve? And is there a clear racial equity proposition that you are moving the needle on? Are you achieving greater access, inclusion, well-being, or asset growth? And what is your North Star? And in addition to that, this is just an example of the many questions in the framework that also now are going to be in sync with the tool that you're going to learn about today. Challenge and assure to say, look at the project differently. What if you pause and just ask different questions? Would you uncover activities that you're doing already, including what your procurement policies look like and others that could help you tell a different story and actually lean into greater areas for action? And in order to do this work, all of it has been grounded by putting communities first. So here you can see we selected our first cohort of technical assistance participants. Here you can actually see them in person when we convened them in Boston this summer. And we brought them together to not only share what they were doing across these 5 pillars, but also what they were going to do to innovate in ways that were bold. And that we could then bring in and share with the market more deeply, and also test what we piloted as our hypothesis in the framework, that there's a meaningful continuum for action, and this is something the market should be aware of. And we're so pleased to be here today because the Urban tool that you're going to learn about in a minute is a vital component of this work, because we want as many self-directed tools out there that operationalize what this framework is trying to introduce to the market, which is a different way to think about your power, your agency, and the ability to look at a transaction in this market and think about it as an agent for change. So with that, I'm going to turn to Amanda Hermans from the Urban Institute, who's going to walk you through the tool and just share that we are really pleased, as you'll hear, that a lot of the components that Amanda will talk about are in sync one-on-one with what the framework itself provides to issuers, giving you an ability to really score and assess the work that you're doing and what you're trying to achieve in place.
Great. Thanks so much, Lourdes, for that. I am Amanda Hermans. I'm a research analyst in the Metropolitan Housing and Communities Policy Center here at the Urban Institute, and I am on the team that developed the Municipal Bond Racial and Social Equity Card, which Lourdes was just referring to, and I'm very happy to be here to share it with you today. So first, I want to thank Lourdes for laying out how our work fits within the broader initiative that her team is leading, looking at racial equity in this space. And I want to add a few more details about why we specifically chose to create this scorecard. As Lourdes just laid out, the muni bond space is a significant source of private investor capital, and the bond market is increasingly focused on ESG, or environmental, social, and governance indicators that focus not just on what's getting built, but also on the expected impacts of the funded projects across a number of dimensions. And many communities across the country are in need of this investment. However, evaluating the benefits and the distribution of these benefits from issuances, particularly in terms of racial and social equity, remains a challenge. So to begin to meet this need, we've worked over the last year and a half with Lourdes's organization and many others to build the Municipal Bond Racial and Social Equity Scorecard, with the goal of helping issuers and borrowers document, self-assess, and summarize the potential racial and social equity of proposed bond issuances. The work of this scorecard also builds on previous work developed at the Urban Institute, specifically the Capital for Communities Scorecard, which is a separate tool that aims to help various project stakeholders assess the possible social impacts of proposed community development projects. And so while the Municipal Bond Racial and Social Equity Scorecard focuses on a different and more specific funding mechanism and a different set of impacts, we were able to use many of the lessons learned from the Capital for Communities Scorecard as a jumping off point for this work. So a little bit about how the scorecard works. We'll walk through a little bit of a demo later in the presentation, but at a high level, the scorecard is set up as a web-based survey that's free to use, open to the public, and is available on the Urban Institute website. It asks you questions about your issuance and then gives you a score as well as a readout of all of your responses. The scorecard is designed to be used at any stage of the bond deal, whether in the pre-issuance, issuance, or post-issuance phase. That being said, we do believe it may be especially useful in the pre-issuance phase before the sale and closing, when users may be able to use the scorecard results to inform decisions about the issuance before it's finalized. It can also be used at multiple times throughout an issuance's lifetime. For example, multiple versions of the scorecard may be used to compare expected impacts of the funded projects in the pre-issuance phase to the actual impacts that you see on the ground in the post-issuance phase. The scorecard can be incorporated into the user's planning process, kept as a record of the issuance for future reference, or shared with community members, future investors, governing bodies, or other stakeholders who can review your responses and compare them against their own knowledge of an issuance's goals or priorities. And the completed scorecard results will never be published or shared with any parties unless the user chooses to do so themselves. So a little bit about how the scorecard is organized. The Municipal Bond Racial and Social Equity Scorecard has 5 sections of questions. You can see them on the screen here. The first section is the Issuer and Bond Basics section, which collects basic information about the issuer and the bond issuances that will be evaluated, such as the name of the bond and the level of government issuing the bond. The second section asks about the policies, practices, and goals related to advancing racial equity or other social impacts that are held by either the issuer or the jurisdiction of the bond deal. The third section asks about the funding sources that are securing the bond. The fourth section asks questions about any community engagement practices that have already been done or will be executed around the projects being funded by the bond deal. And the fifth and longest section asks about specific project outputs that may advance racial or social equity for the projects being funded by the bond. The first 3 sections here collect vital information for understanding the context of the bond issuances, but they are not scored. Instead, the answers to these questions are printed in the scorecard output to produce a detailed record of the bond issuances. Questions in the final 2 sections, which ask about discrete community engagement activities and projected outputs from the use of proceeds, are the ones that contribute to the score. As I said, the 5th section, the use of proceeds section, is the longest, and it has questions about project outputs that are organized into these 7 impact areas. That is accessible high-quality jobs, community wealth building, affordable and accessible housing, environment and open spaces, health, social services, and cultural amenities, transportation and transit, and schools and education. So users will answer questions about what they expect will be produced by the use of proceeds in these various areas. And one thing that we learned based on our work on the Capital for Communities scorecard was that it was important to allow the scorecard to be adaptive to individual communities, understanding that every community has nuanced context and needs when it comes to investment. So the way that we do this is that in section 2, we ask users to rank these 7 impact areas against each other based on their understanding of their community's specific priorities, with 1 being the most relative importance and 7 being the least relative importance. This assigns each impact area a weight that increases the score for the most important impact areas while diminishing the scores for the least important. For example, if you say that housing is the most important impact area in your community, your answers to the housing questions will contribute more heavily to your score than your answers to the questions about jobs or schools. This process of weighting, grounded in community priorities, allows the scorecard to adapt to different community environments. A few additional items about scoring. The questions you receive are catered to the specific project types that you indicate will be conducted with the use of proceeds. For example, if you don't select the housing project type, you will not receive all the housing related questions in the scorecard. And your total possible score is then only based on the questions you actually see. And because this scorecard is specifically focused on racial and social equity, for many features of the projects funded by the bond proceeds, we care not only about the output produced, but also about how much of that output is anticipated to be available to low-income people, people of color, and other historically marginalized groups. To address this, many questions in our impact areas have follow-up racial and social equity multiplier questions, which ask what share of a specific benefit will go to these groups. The higher the share that's selected, the higher number of points the user will receive for the reported output. And finally, only closed-ended questions are scored, but we know that there are many cases where a simple yes or no answer is not enough. So to account for this, there are many open-ended or free answer questions that allow the user to provide additional context or explanations. And while these open-ended answers are not scored, they will still be included in the scorecard output for context. You can see a more detailed explanation of our scoring methodology in our user guide, which is on our website. Now, I want to give a bit of a demo of the scorecard. Because the scorecard is long and has many questions, I've pulled out a few images of key illustrative questions rather than clicking through the entire tool for you today. These will hopefully give you a good sense of the look and feel of the tool, as well as some of the typical types of questions you may see. But of course, if you want to dive more into the tool yourself, you can feel free to access it on our homepage on the Urban Institute website. So when you click into the tool, the first thing you'll see is our registration page. This page asks you to enter your email. You will then be sent a unique survey link for your scorecard session. You can share this link with other team members or partners to collaborate on filling out the scorecard, which can be helpful if certain team members know more about different aspects of the issuance than others. In addition, your answers to questions will automatically save, and you can leave the scorecard and return to this link later to pick up where you left off. Once you click on the unique link in your email, you'll be taken to your scorecard session. The first page includes instructions and pointers to read before beginning the tool. When you advance to section 1, you'll see some questions about the basic details of the bond, including the issuance's name and the name of the issuer. And as you can see on the left here, you will also always have access to a table of contents, which will allow you to jump between the 5 main sections of questions. In section 2, you'll be asked about baseline racial and social equity policies and practices held by the issuer or the jurisdiction. You can see here that when yes was selected for the question asking if the user has a definition of racial equity, another question popped up underneath with a free answer box allowing the user to type in their definition. Anything typed in this box will be included in the final scorecard output. Section 2 is also where the user is asked to rank the 7 impact areas based on their understanding of community priorities. The user can drag these priorities into order, with 1 being the highest relative priority and 7 being the lowest relative priority. Here I'm showing the question at the beginning of section 5, where the user is asked to select which project type or types are being funded by the use of proceeds. The user can select as many project types as are relevant, and then the user will only see questions that are relevant to those specific project types. This is an example of some questions in the jobs portion of section 5. You can see the more information links at the end of these questions. If you click on these, they provide tips, resources, suggestions, and definitions of key terms that may help the user answer questions. These more information links can be found on many questions throughout the tool. Finally, I wanted to show a question in the education section, which gives an example of the racial and social equity multiplier questions. You can see that the first question here asks if the projects funded by the issuance will improve educational conditions or create an educational benefit for the community. The next question below asks what share of these benefits is anticipated to be available to low-income people, people of color, and other historically marginalized groups. The higher the share that's selected, the higher number of points the user will receive for their reported educational output. And finally, after completing the scorecard questions and pressing submit, the user will receive a PDF scorecard, which looks like what you see on the right side of the screen here. The first page will include the user's bond issuance score weighted by their community priorities, a graphic illustrating the scores across the different impact areas, and some guidance on how to interpret their score. This is the first page of the scorecard, and then the following pages will include a comprehensive list of all the users' responses. The numerical scores are grouped into 4 categories that describe the issuance's expected impact on racial or social equity conditions in the affected communities. These categories are very high, high, moderate, or low. You can see here that the issuance for this scorecard received a high rating, meaning that we believe it is likely to provide substantial racial or social equity benefits that are aligned with community priorities based on the answers that they provided. Before wrapping up, I want to note here that we know that one score will never tell the whole story of an issuance, and that a user's score may serve as just one factor when considering an issuance's potential for racial or social equity benefits. But we hope that the scorecard can give issuers a standard process by which to think through and reflect on an issuance's potential for racial or social equity benefits, or possibly compare different potential issuances or options within issuances against each other. It can help fill an information gap, serve as a conversational starter with investors or other stakeholders, or help during the planning process of an issuance. Now, I know that we've walked through the tool very quickly and at a high level, but if you'd like to do a deeper dive, I encourage you to check out our scorecard homepage, which has many resources that can help you get started on using the scorecard, including a user guide, a complete list of scorecard questions, and a sample scorecard. Now I will pass it back to Brett, who will moderate a panel focused on the real-world use cases of this work.
Thanks, Amanda, for walking us through. There's so much, as you can see, that was baked into the tool. So much testing, so much iterating, so much refining. And we also would love for some real-world applications and use. And so please kick the tires and send us your thoughts as you get it out into the real world. But let's have a discussion about the broader implications for the field, where we're at, potential use cases, where we can go from here. So let me welcome Lauren up to our virtual stage and Lourdes back as well. And we are gonna have a discussion. And as we do want to hear from you. So please, we've got a couple of questions that are coming in, but add your questions as well to the Q&A box, and I will fold them into our discussion time. But let's just start by way of intros. Lauren, if you don't mind helping us to get a sense of who you are and where you sit, and then Lourdes will ask you to do the same.
Yeah, sounds good. Thanks, Brett. My name's Lauren Burdett. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the Deputy Chief Equity Officer here in the city of Chicago. And in Chicago, the new Office of Equity and Racial Justice, we're about 4 years old. We sit in the mayor's office in City Hall. So I've been here for about all 4 of those years, actually. And before that was in state and federal policy doing education work.
And tell us, Lauren, just one more word about your office, how its function is unique, the role it serves, maybe even do other cities have this function? Just give us a little more of a picture of that.
So we have quite the charge. We are charged with overseeing the development, coordination, and administration of all racial and social equity policy and practice for the entire city, which is a large job. We're 2.7 million people. The city employees alone with it under the mayor are about 30,000. So it's not a small task that we have. But at its core, basically what it means is we are working with people across the city in every single department, whether you're education, transportation, water. We're training you in racial equity. We're helping them, partnering with city departments to figure out what are their goals that they could be improving, what are systems and internal processes they could be fixing and or adjusting to drive towards better, more racially equitable outcomes. And then ultimately, we're also identifying high potential systemic policy and process changes that are intersecting across the city that will drive greater equity across Chicago, which is why I'm here. I am not a municipal bond expert, but this is definitely an opportunity that the city needs to pursue. And this scorecard is a really amazing opportunity that we see that we can actually start driving more equitable investments across the city.
Thanks. Lourdes.
Thank you, Brett. And I want to acknowledge Lauren. She's one of the issuers that the city of Chicago, that we selected for our first cohort. and definitely has been integral in shaping a lot of this work. But my background in municipal finance includes wearing a lot of hats in one very niche field that started with serving as bond counsel, disclosure counsel for municipalities who are trying to use municipal bonds to raise money or write special legislation to let them do things that otherwise their state would not allow. And then helping to lead the creation and growth of Fidelity Investments investment banking unit in the New York's tri-state region. And then working at Breckenridge Capital Advisors, a separately managed account firm that does a high volume of municipal bond investing as the company's first general counsel and vice president of research. And then holding several roles, both in higher ed that included at Boston College, the University of Chicago, and now currently on the faculty at the Harvard Graduate School of Design, where I teach public finance, and then working also within a foundation at the Lincoln Institute when we launched a global program on municipal fiscal health to really consider the power of philanthropy and marshaling a body of work that could help governments think about the strength of their fiscal base as an agent for change and vital to the role in the future that we want to see in communities. And currently, as you heard earlier on, now lead the Public Finance Initiative, a small nonprofit really thinking about this work every single day. And the only other role that I've held in government that's relevant to this, but both have been in a volunteer capacity, have been serving our governor in Massachusetts for 7 years, chair of the Massachusetts State Finance and Governance Board.
Terrific. Thanks for the background to get a sense of where you both are coming from. Just one clarifying question we had in the Q&A that I want to get straight first so everybody can be on the same page before we dig in more. These are called muni bonds, but that doesn't only mean municipalities are the issuers. So if you could just walk us through a basic level of who issues these types of bonds, who are we have a city here, but that's not the only option for who we could have had here. Can you give us that quick rundown, Lourdes?
Sure. It's a great question. A municipal bond issuer can be basically anything that any entity that qualifies, within either state laws of their state and being enabled to issue bonds, and particularly to pursue so with that designation of a government that aligns with the IRS definition that would allow them to qualify for a tax-exempt subsidy. One of the big reasons why this market is so large. And just in really simple terms, it could be a city, a town, a school district, a public authority that's an instrumentality of a state. It could be the state itself. It could be a county, basically anything that qualifies under the definition of what's called Section 103 of the IRS code as a government that can issue. And there are also many issuers like charter schools, for example, that work in tandem with state authorities, nonprofits, and universities. And I think the part of the question in the chat was, do those entities, can they use the scorecard? The answer is yes.
Love it. So a pretty broad market, broader than maybe most people recognize or anticipate. Okay, let's start with what is the state of play out there? Lauren, before you started thinking about this, or maybe the mayor or the one before that, what's the state of play among issuers? Lourdes, as you look out more broadly, why do we care about the issue of how these muni bonds are being spent, how this capital is getting mobilized? Lauren, let's start with you.
Sure. So I can just speak from our perspective in the city. So when ARPA dollars came from the federal government, it's an unprecedented once in a lifetime opportunity in terms of the amount of money from the federal government. And the other thing that I think the Biden administration did really well was centering the impact of COVID on both health and economic impact in how we spent that money. And so what we did in the city was decided that we needed to also issue bonds and stack investments in multiple ways, but using that same criteria and saying, how do we actually center racial equity, which is at its core, right? We know COVID had a disparate impact on the Black community, on communities of color across the nation, but particularly in Chicago too. And so centering that value in our bond projects and the projects that we were funding with those bonds was a really different way of approaching it than we had in the past. We've had bonds in the past that tend to be, our bridges are broken and they need to be fixed, which is important. But being able to center this value has been really a key for us. And the other thing I'll say is that we were able to actually then pair that with a really, the part about impact, I think, is really key to highlight here. People, there's not a lot of trust in government right now across America, and Chicago also struggles with that. And so being able to demonstrate, hey, here's how the debt we're taking on, here's where the money is going, and here's the impact that we are seeing in XYZ communities or in XYZ outcomes for people, is going to be essential for all governments moving forward if we're going to maintain our representative democracy. And our bonds and ARPA funds, we actually have a really amazing website where we are experimenting with that, called ChiRecoveryPlan.com. And we are hopeful that moving forward, all of our bond issuances can actually have that same level of transparency and outcomes that we had with those.
And to answer your question, Brett, I think at a macro level, Lauren is emblematic of a phenomena that predates this project, which is the advent of issuances that are designated and labeled to carry a value explicitly in their title. And what does this mean? I think back to the Detroit example that I shared earlier in the presentation, where someone says these are not just City of Detroit general obligation bonds that tells you something about just the security. But by adding the word social, by adding the word green, by adding the word sustainability right in the title, it became a market trend that started, probably a decade ago or more, and specifically is intended to connote that there is a social, green, or otherwise sustainable value in the issuance. Because issuers see either a benefit of bringing investors to the table, because the diversification created by more investors coming to the table can actually lead to a better economic result in the transaction itself, potentially, if that occurs. But then also over time means that more investors are looking at 2-year deals in a different way, particularly for sustainability portfolios. And that can only generate, hopefully, an economic benefit over time for an issuer to have more investors rather than less at the table. And in addition to that, whatever place-based outcomes or population level outcomes you want to achieve, that could also be advanced by the deal.
It's, we can't, we're bound contractually. We can't get through a whole webinar on this topic without pulling out the old adage that it's, your priorities based on where your money is spent. And where you're spending your money, how you're spending your money is revealing your priorities, whether you want it to or not. And that's what's so important about the municipal bond market. And speaking for myself editorially for a moment, the muni bond market has in some ways gotten a pass on scrutiny about its spending with respect to social and equity and race equity dimensions that other avenues of government spending really have gotten more examination and scrutiny. So it's in that broader spirit of it's time, it's a good effort. Not everything is broken, not everything is wrong, but it is also good to reflect proactively on what we're achieving with the money that we're spending, even if that money, isn't in the very literal sense taxed and spent the same way as it is without this is the federal role that is being played here. So let's dig in a little bit more. We've talked about issuers. I want to talk about ratings and people that are in this space, how this is being built out, the landscape, field developments. There has been a lot of growth and change here. Some point to it as really positive. Others think it's more window dressing and it hasn't adequately moved where things need to go. But just bring us up to speed on where we're at with rating, assessing muni bond efforts.
And Lauren, I don't know if you want to speak about that as an issuer. I can give a more macro view.
Yeah, I think you should go.
So if you were to look at the activities across all of the major rating agencies, Standard & Poor's, Fitch, and so on and so forth, Moody's and Kroll, every one of them has an articulated approach to what's called ESG and that sort of environmental, social, and governance risk, and how that is considered. And it could be the approaches are all different and unique to each firm with some threads of consistency, but often the key things that I look for when I'm evaluating this at a macro level to see how the industry is changing is the degree to which the assessment of that risk is specifically impacting a credit quality analysis. So these are non-financial things, but could they be material to an investor? And if so, how is a rating agency considering them? And the second piece around which there's, I would say, different approaches is whether and how that there's a separate ESG rating that exists to tell the investor something about those environmental, social, and governance factors that does not cross into sort of the credit rating report. Whether somebody's AAA or BBB is either impacted or not by what's happening on that ESG assessment side of the house. And I think over time, we'll see how the market continues to shift and change and evolve, but at least sort of each rating agency has their own unique approach to that process, if that makes sense.
Great. And, this really is a development that in some ways is much bigger and broader than the muni bond market, but has, in part because of the strong governmental role, has really played out strongly in this space as well. So thanks. Keep your questions coming. We've got a good list. We're going to try to work through them, but keep adding them as we go. So let's turn to a tool. We'll talk a little bit more about this particular one in a minute, but I just want to understand, why would you want a tool? What can you do? What do you do? Your processes, Lauren. Let's start with you.
Yeah, so one of the core responsibilities we have in the Office of Equity and Racial Justice is bringing new tools to the city and new ways of thinking, new processes for government teams. We define racial equity as both a process and an outcome. And the process itself, the way we make these decisions, the way we decide where bond money goes, for instance, whether we decide we're using bond money or TIF money, for instance, that matters as much as the outcome that we are trying to drive towards. And so for us, the tool, and I was very excited. I think the first meeting I had about this tool, I was just a total nerd the whole time, like going through and like figuring out each different piece and how it would impact us. And one piece I want to highlight that I think Amanda mentioned, but just to double down on it, the fact that we can each issuer can identify the top priority that they have in terms of what they want to change about their city is hugely important, because it means that over time, as a community's priorities shift, you can actually shift and still continue to use the tool. It doesn't become out of date. Another example I'll share, and this is something we're working on in our TA with the Public Finance Initiative. Our Chicago Department of Transportation created an index of mobility. They would call it the MOBEC index. It stands for Mobility and Economic Hardship Index. And it is a process that they built with some community partners that helps them score infrastructure projects that wherever the money comes from, and they can say, hey, okay, this particular, road repair or safe streets project is actually going to have a significant impact on racial equity because of where it is, or because it's connecting potentially a senior center or some other high need population to grocery, to healthcare, et cetera. And I think, giving examples from the macro that we can apply across multiple cities and that very micro sort of how do you select your projects is really key to changing the way government works, right? Going back to kind of one of our charges, looking across the entire city of Chicago enterprise and trying to figure out how we can shift investment to center people who've been disinvested in for so long. So I'm a huge fan of any tool that can help us do that, including this one.
Awesome. Lourdes, you commissioned this thing in some ways, right? So what's your vision?
So I think when we saw the history of the Opportunity Zone tool and the emerging work that Brett and team were doing around capital for communities, we really had sort of a light bulb moment, and we thought, how do we create, ask you to create something with us that would work in sync with this framework, but actually cater to the issuer who is self-directed, or a stakeholder working with the issuer to support decision making. And it specifically speaks to one of the questions that I saw raised in the chat, where somebody said, well, how does it help with decision making? I mean, think about this. What if you've never asked questions about how you're planning to finance the bonds? And you might have a great project that you think is advancing racial equity. You might have great and thoughtful community engagement. But what if the way that you're actually thinking of financing the deal itself has something within it that could undermine every single outcome that you're trying to achieve with the project and all those other processes. This tool and the framework, together in sync with the questions, challenge you to engage in a moment of reflection. We don't tell you what to do with what you learn. We don't tell you what strategic decisions to take with what it reveals, but we invite you to ask the questions, to think differently. And part of what it could do, and this is, I think, ties back to why Amanda hearkened that we really believe this can be done at any stage, even after you've issued the bonds and just want to tell the story, see the results, and monitor that over time, that if you use it early enough in what we call pre-issuance, even maybe where there's just a capital plan with the project, and you're thinking that this is going to be authorized and to be funded by bonds, but you still have wiggle room to bring in other funds, you can start asking questions about how that patchwork of financing is going to come together and say, what does it reveal to us about what we're trying to achieve here? And because municipal bonds are such long dated securities, they're out for a very long duration. These are not 1 year, 3-month instruments. These are often 20, 30, 40, even 100-year instruments at times. You can lock in intergenerational inequities that could completely undermine what you're trying to achieve with the project. And we just want to surface moments of strategic decision making where you could see either generative opportunities or real risks that you might want to be attentive to.
Really helpful reflections. Part of the challenge, as I see it, a little bit akin to the opportunity zone space, is also really one of the advantages of the Munibond tool, which is to say it is so flexible. You can do so many different things with Munibond financing. And that really is a wonderful thing in many regards. But that also really presents hard choices in terms of where to prioritize, what to prioritize, both on the how we pay for it side and also what we expect it to accomplish and where. So that to me is where we need some help, this or otherwise, to reduce some of the complexity, understand the trade-offs, because sometimes we're trading off good thing against bad thing. Sometimes we really have to consider good thing against great thing, or even good against good. And those are really tough decisions. And so some sort of structured way to help think those through, which really is fundamentally about dialogue, self-dialogue, partner dialogue, really as a way to set a table and have a discussion so that we can talk through priorities, areas of emphasis, assumptions that maybe we didn't realize we held, not necessarily bad ones, but just assumptions about what we're able to accomplish in what time frame, what's our most important and pressing priority. Okay, let's talk about some of the real worldness of this and try to bring it to life. Maybe some examples of equitable processes in issuances that you've seen, how a decision-making tool can help in that process, but just help make it plain to us in this way. Lauren, we'll start with you.
Sure. I mean, I'm going to shout out again our transportation department, because I think that's one of the best examples that we have, because, and it's an example of where on their own, and that concept of that you mentioned, kind of the people who are independently willing to kind of partner with communities. And when you have, there's so many priorities our transportation department has, right? We have a lot of bridges in Chicago. We have a ton of deferred maintenance. We have very old buildings. We have very old structures like vaulted sidewalks that need to be repaired. And so how do you balance the real needs of deferred maintenance that the city has and that are liabilities on us with some of the, actual safe streets investments and some of the priorities that community members are having? And I just really credit that team for saying, yes, we still need to maintain and pay and fix our deferred maintenance issues, but we also need to find a way to prioritize among these projects, all of which are good, right? We want safe streets across the whole city, but you're going to have a limited amount of money. So how do you prioritize where the first set of investments go? They should go in communities that are most impacted, where folks are furthest away from public transit, where folks have the highest traffic fatalities, where there's the least options for bike lanes, etc. So I think that, getting that down to that nitty gritty and being willing to say, look, yep, we're going to make this trade-off. And that's a trade-off that is definitely the right thing to do, even though we're going to have to defend it to other, folks who may be upset that they didn't get the kind of investment they're used to seeing in their neighborhood, is really important. And the other thing I'll say is that another reason we got involved in this is because Chicago has relied heavily on TIF districts and TIF funding for our economic development and affordable housing investments for several mayors now. And I think we need to, by definition, TIFs are geographically bound in how they can be spent. And so it's really limited our ability to invest effectively and strategically across the city. So those of you who've been to Chicago and been to West Loop, it's great. It's thriving. Things are going really well over there. A lot of that's because of TIF investment. But our neighborhoods like West Garfield Park or Englewood, where either they don't have a TIF or where the TIF isn't generating enough increment, we haven't been able to invest the same amount of money because of the financial tools that we are using. And so it goes back to the reason that muni bonds are so powerful in their flexibility and the importance of centering racial equity in the projects which they fund.
Yeah, those are great examples. And I'll give a couple others that are, cities, for example, like the city and county of Denver, who we featured in our National League of Cities report, has an initiative that doesn't use the word social when they go to market. They call it Elevate and Rise Denver. And if you actually look under the hood, Denver, very close to Chicago, has a really thorough racial equity program that specifically crosses across multiple domains of their municipal finances. And when they actually issue bonds, they're able to sort of bring up everything that comes from that foundation that also has a nexus and bearing to capital projects. And it's not sort of a one and done, here's one transaction, but they actually have like a 10-year capital plan that specifically also has a layer of transparency to citizens, where you can actually see, where are these investments happening? Who are they impacting, which zip codes, which I encourage everyone to check out. Another example that speaks to the question early on, which said, it's not just cities and towns that are doing this, but public authorities. The Nevada Bond Bank is one of the few bond banks in the country that has a specific social value written into one of their loan programs. So what does this mean? That if you're a small city and town, particularly, or a rural community, say, this is not how I borrow. I don't go out and do these large deals like Chicago, New York, or Denver. I might go to a bond bank for a smaller borrowing because they're my state conduit and entity through which I actually fund capital projects using a lending instrument. And isn't it remarkable that if they want to lean into a process that actually centers a social value, there's a bond bank that actually enables that with the kind of loan program that they have. And it gets back to the water example that I used early on, where it's sort of a state authority can actually create an enabling environment for borrowing that also centers value for smaller communities who don't access the capital markets on their own.
And I think what's becoming clear through all of this is not just how many uses there are, but just how many issuers. There's so many places that are needing to confront these decisions on a regular and ongoing basis, and the complexity that entails. We got a couple of questions from folks who want to understand the self-identification, self-rating process. Is there accountability baked in? Is there second-party verification? I'll take that and answer that quickly. We decided pretty early on, we faced a fork in the road, whether to become the good housekeeping seal of approval of a project, or to create a resource that would allow people to understand themselves, reflect on it, adjust, and go forward. And we opted for this second, in part because there are some groups that are doing some measure of assessment in the muni bond space as already, but also because we really wanted the dialogue more than the imprimatur. But there is an accountability mechanism, and that's called releasing your score and releasing your insights. So if you're going to claim that you're doing well on the basis of our tool, you can produce those results. And there's a scorecard that's auto-generated with an API after all of the entries are filled. And it will say very clearly what people are claiming and not claiming on that basis. And so anybody who's claiming things, the evidence is right there inherent. Okay, a couple minutes for other questions that we're going to pull in from the Q&A, and also from this group. I guess where I just wanted to start is acknowledging our broader moment. We certainly have seen a backlash to ESG generally. Not all of that is in the muni bond space, but it's adjacent, or it's there in part as well. And we've certainly seen the broader jurisprudence being challenged and even overturned with respect to which race can be explicitly considered as a criteria in a number of domains, still in flux in many regards. But I guess, how do you understand this current moment, how these decisions are being made, how people can consider proactively accomplishing social good? Help us to situate all of this in our current moment.
Lauren, do you want to go first? Or?
Yeah, you can go.
One of the things that we think about is, we work with the cohort of the willing, where there's a community or an issuer who sees value in having support and their capacity built and resources that are available and open. That's what we are here to provide. And we understand that with Brett, as you said earlier, like, America is highly fragmented in the number and types of issuers and issuances that exist. And that's the nature of the market. It's a patchwork. Also, we're at the state level, there are different approaches that are either hostile or friendly to ESG. The one thing that we do not dispute, and that is undisputed, is the level of investor activity that is driven alone when we think about capitalism towards sustainability-minded portfolios, impact-minded portfolios, ESG portfolios, specifically because investors recognize that whether or not you care about impact, there is an asset gathering opportunity when you think that looking at more data rather than less, particularly non-financial data, helps you insulate against risk. And that's where we are here to resource, is both to listen to all sides of that equation and to make the market stronger for those who want to participate in it.
Great. So let's turn to just a couple of questions that we want to tuck in. We've got a couple of ones that are asking for links and we will follow up after this with doing those sorts of things. But we're also wondering about, some questions that relate to representation and that's something we actually considered, Lourdes, along the way. Who's filling out the cards specifically? Anything you want to add in that dimension?
I think that we have left it to the issuer, because if you think about it, that when an issuer sells bonds to the market, who prepares and tells the story in the document that's created pursuant to securities rule? The issuer. It's up to them. Only they choose if they want to go out and get a third-party verifier. And that's because this information matters. It has to be done carefully. It has to be done under securities laws, like, 10b-5 and others that say, like, like, there are material decisions that investors are making here. And given the importance of that process, I think one of the unique benefits of this tool is that communities can actually fill it out with all the stakeholders who hold information. They can come together, that there can be consensus, and it can actually lead to stronger decision-making that is cross-functional. And I believe that's one of the pieces that I'm most excited about this tool, because we're seeing this dynamic also play out in our technical assistance program with different communities. We're saying, hey, this decision needs all these departments at the table, because it's not just centered in finance. And the tool, I think, really enables that, which is the gathering and thinking and facilitation of information flow that's more robust and transparent. And then it still is up to the issuer, because that's the holder of the information who gets to disclose it at the end of the day in the most important document for a deal, to make that choice. We're not going to make it for them, because it's an important decision.
Terrific. Okay, last word. I know we're closing in on time. Lauren, what's next? Where do you go from here? Lourdes, same question. What's next? Where do you go from here? Your cohort and the like. Lauren.
Our cohort's almost done. So I'm really excited to actually take the recommendations and take it to the mayor and other senior leaders and be like, here's what we do next, right? Like, here's the structure that we want all of our departments that are going to utilize bond funds to use to prioritize projects. And then I'm also really excited to explore the opportunity of this scorecard. We've involved a lot of community partners in our TA along the way. And I think that speaking with them and figuring out what is the right kind of balance of prioritization and like ongoing engagement of priorities, and when do you shift priorities, making sure you are bringing those folks that are really diverse to the table, is, I think, what's next for us. So I'm excited.
Yeah, and I think for us, I mean, and Brett and team, thank you for now that we have this moment in time. I think for us, we sort of begin a deeper storytelling phase, not just sharing new tools and ways to actually use and operationalize the framework in ways that are self-directed, but also sharing in different forums the stories of the issuers like Lauren and others who've been doing really hard work, leaning into innovation in ways that I think could really stand to shape the market in ways that are exciting, sharing those lessons and then recruiting for our next cohort and then deepening this work with our partners.
Exciting. Uh, Great to be at this moment. Thank you so much, Lauren. Thank you, Lourdes. Thank you, Amanda. Thanks to Kim Rubin. And before that, Martha, Kate, Solomon. So many people have contributed to previous iterations of this. And to all of the issuers who vetted it and kicked tires, all the members of the partners that are part of the initiative, terrific. To Alex on your team and so many others. So thank you, and looking forward to continuing to engage. Thanks for joining, everyone.